Here we are on our 11th lecture on the Cappadocians, and once again we're with Gregory Nyssa, who is the youngest of the three Cappadocians, and I've chosen one of his works, perhaps one of the shorter works, although there are a number of short ones, and this is called On the Soul and Resurrection, On the Soul and Resurrection, and again is published by St. Vladimir's Press in New York and can be obtained probably through Amazon. It was written later on in his life, probably round about 380 AD, and it's written just after the death of his brother Basil. And we see this indicated in this conversation. And this is a conversation. It's what I would call a Platonic conversation. That's to say, it's modelled on some of the works of Plato, who had many dialogues, you remember, in which Socrates was speaking about various things. And this one is modelled on one of those dialogues called Phaedo. And it's between Gregory Nissan, or Gregory of Nyssa, and his older sister Macrina. And Macrina also is dying. She has cancer. And she's dying from the cancer. Basil, their distinguished brother, has recently died. And Gregory is now composing, really, this conversation between himself and Macrina. Whether it exactly happened like this, we don't know. It could be a kind of fabrication of what it might have looked like had this conversation taken place between the two of them. And it is essentially a dialogue about what will happen at death, seeing as Macrina was facing death. And in this conversation she has the role of the teacher, and Gregory has the role of the pupil, the one who is being instructed. And it's a debate between the two of them, a discussion between the two of them about the nature of the death, and because it's rather Platonic, the nature of the soul. And so one of the first things they discuss is, what is the soul? What is the nature of the soul? And they conclude that the human being, to use the language that they use in this dialogue, is a microcosm of the cosmos. And by use of our senses and intuition, we have assumed that the soul exists in itself, with its own nature, utterly different from the solidity of the body. Further definition arising from philosophy is given of the soul. It is an essence which has a beginning. It is a living and intellectual essence which by itself gives to the organic and sensory body the power of life. Now, an interesting discussion could be had about the nature of the soul, as it were, from the Jewish angle, where there's not much said about the soul, perhaps, and then on the Greek angle, or Greek teaching, which makes much of the soul in the writings of Plato and in the writings of some of the more Platonic Christian authors like Origen, who had a deep influence, you remember, on the Cappadocians through the teaching of Gregory the Wonder Worker, who was one of Origen's pupils. The soul, they say, is like a mirror or fragment of glass that can reflect the sun. In the same way, they argue, the smallness of our nature and soul may reflect the ineffable properties of divinity. So what they're saying is, we have there within us this thing called the soul, which has the capacity within the human frame to reflect something of the divinity by which it was made. They go on to say that the soul is affected by emotions. The soul obviously has a great impulse, Macrina says, of desire, and another great impulse of anger. These are the two emotions which, according to them, often drive the soul in its voyage and its progression. On the one hand, desire, and on the other hand, anger. But then they say between them that we cannot allow that to happen, to have a sort of free-for-all for either desire or emotion, that these two things must be restrained and directed and self-disciplined or disciplined by the teaching of Holy Scripture. Just as Moses in his journey had to take charge over his own anger at one point in order to become the kind of person that he was meant to be. They turn then to the question of the soul after death and Hades. And the teacher again, Macrina, says there are three types of existence in creation. Bodiless souls, which are like angels, created in that way. Souls with bodies, which is us today in our everyday life. And then souls that are released from the body, which may be found in Hades, awaiting resurrection. And then they begin to consider what this resurrection would look like. What is the life of the soul after death? They have this idea of Hades, but more than that, they go on to discuss the idea of the soul being purged of things that it has picked up during life, which he needs to be made free of. And this gives them the whole idea of what we would call purging or purgatory, which was an idea beginning to enter into the life of the church and would become very strong, of course, later on, certainly in Europe in the medieval world. I don't know how it is in a Greek and Coptic understanding. And finally, at Gregory's prompting of Macrina, the nature of resurrection itself is looked at. It's interesting that it's not until the very end of this dialogue do they begin to understand what the Christian understanding of resurrection was. They look at some of the Psalms, the prophet Ezekiel and the valley of the dry bones and life being given to those formless and aged bones. And then principally the writings of 1 Corinthians 15 by the Apostle Paul, who talks about the kind of resurrection body and the kind of resurrection that we can hope for, and also the evidence of Jesus' miracles in John chapter 11 and the raising of Lazarus from the dead. So what we have here is a kind of reflection on the idea of the soul and resurrection, set in a Platonic discussion, but ending up with an affirmation of what Christian resurrection means from the scriptures, both Old Testament and New Testament. I close with a quotation from the Apostle Paul, which they referred to. As the Apostle said, "The body that is sown is perishable, it is raised imperishable. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body." That is the ending reflection of this discussion on the soul and resurrection between a brother and a sister in about 380 AD, with Macrina dying from her cancer, Basil having died, and the two of them looking with hope to resurrection and new life. Thank you.